In this video, we're going to look at the issue of word meaning and how it has been thought about from the perspective of prototype semantics. Looking at some of the history there. These are the kind of big questions that we're going to be thinking about. How do our minds organize meaning? How do we classify some things as being the same or different from others? This is a question of categorization. What puts some things in one category and not in another category? And what is the role of words in our cognitive processes? Many of those categories are labeled by words. So when we hear a word like bird, what are the things that are in that category? What are the concepts associated with it in our minds? And following on from that, how can we appropriately talk about word meanings in texts? Are meanings actually in texts, or are they in people's minds? And we've talked about this before in terms of the different worlds, the world of the text, the world of the mind, and the real world, and how do words connect between those different worlds. These sorts of questions are very important for people involved in translation, because one key part of translation is often the translation of words. And if we're going to help people translate words, we start asking, what do these words mean? And if we're going to start answering that question, what do words mean? We need to have a really good understanding, not just what words might mean, but also how words mean. How do real people actually connect words with meaning when they use them or hear them? So as an overview, what we're going to look at here is to explore these questions. And we're going to do that by looking at the cognitive linguistic approach from Langacker, from Lakoff, and from Taylor. And we're going to see the importance of prototypes, the idea of a schematic network approach to words and concepts, and the influence of domains, cognitive domains, on how our minds process words that might connect to those domains. But to start off with, as we start thinking about categorization and word meaning, let's think about the category of furniture. Hopefully this is a word you're familiar with. And we're thinking about the things that are labeled by the word furniture. That creates a category. Remember that some models of word meaning would say that words have fixed meaning components, so it should be easy to decide whether something is furniture or if it isn't. But what about these? Here's a list of different words: lamp, telephone, ashtray, chair, bookcase, refrigerator, television, coffee table. Are these all furniture? Have a think. Which ones do you think are furniture? Which ones aren't furniture? Are some better examples and some worse examples? What is it about something that makes it furniture? These examples actually come from some work done by Eleanor Rosch in the 1970s, where she was trying to explore some of these issues around word meaning, and she asked various Americans what they thought. I wonder what you came up with as being the most furniture, typical element of furniture in this list. When she did her rating and then she summarized it across different people, the low numbers here show the ones that people thought were a very good example, and the high numbers are bad examples. So you can see that the chair and the coffee table with 1.04 and 1.38, they were considered the best examples of furniture, whereas the telephone and the ashtray are the least good examples of furniture. Maybe they're such bad examples, they're not really furniture at all. But in between, we have these things like lamps and bookcases and televisions that are sort of examples of furniture, but sort of not. And it raises questions about what is this category of furniture? Is it something that Are you just either you are or you aren't, or is it a bit more fuzzy? The point is that often our own folk models of categorizations of things suggest that something either does or does not belong to a category. For example, an animal we see in someone's house is either a dog or a cat. It's not something in between. But what we find is that actually the boundaries of most concepts are fuzzy. Think about dogs again. Well, are wolves, dingoes, and hyenas, are they dogs or are they not dogs? Or are they dogs, but just not the prototypical dogs that we think of? So maybe rather than saying there are certain things that make something a piece of furniture or not, we have rather several prototypical pieces of furniture. Maybe it's based on their shape or what we use them for sitting down on, or for putting our cups of coffee on. And we decide whether something is furniture or not based on how close they are to that prototype. This might also be true if you think about something like a vegetable. What actually makes something a vegetable? Maybe it's like because it's like other vegetables that we know because we cook it in a certain way. I noticed that when Rosch did these kind of furniture experiments with students in a different context in Germany, using the closest German word to furniture, they actually had different ratings, different prototypes for what is most typically a piece of furniture. Another experiment from a similar time looked at whether people thought a picture represented a cup or a bowl. Here's the pictures that they used, and people had to decide which category they would put each of these images in. This is the kind of results that came up when they were just shown the pictures in the abstract. You'll see that the line at the top shows that number one, everyone classified that as a cup and nobody classified it as a bowl. But as the ratio between the diameter and the height of the cup got bigger, moving towards the right in this diagram, people were more likely to call something a bowl than a cup. However, what's really interesting is that when they showed these pictures in the context of food, then the ratings changed. So if people saw the image next to something else that showed some food, then they suddenly began to recognize them as being bowls, or think it was appropriate to call them bowls, much earlier on, with a much a smaller ratio of the diameter to the height. What's important here is it shows that the context makes a difference to how people categorize things. Whether we think this is a bowl or a cup doesn't just depend on what it looks like, but the context in which it appears. Let's look at one more experiment, going back to the work of Eleanor Rosch. One of the things she did was go around and show people pictures of birds, and she asked them which of them are the best examples. So have a look at this little picture yourself. Which of these do you think are the best examples of birds? You could try and rate them from 1 to 12 for the different images here, or just spend a moment thinking, those are the ones which I think are really good examples, and those are the ones that I'd rate a bit lower. Again, when she did this experiment, there was remarkable similarity across different people who would give the same kind of ratings. The robin was generally ranked as the most birdie, and the penguin and the ostrich as the least birdie. Does that agree with what you thought? What it suggests is that we have some kind of prototypical image of what a bird is, and we judge other birds based on their similarity to that prototype. This experiment demonstrates what's called a prototype effect, that we see some members of a category as more typical than others. Other prototype effects from Rosch's research were that people were quicker to answer yes or no to a question like an X is a Y, i.e. a robin is a bird, with more prototypical instances than they were with more marginal members. It took them longer to answer yes or no when they were asked, a duck is a bird. So do we have some kind of prototypical picture of a bird? It has wings and feathers and lays eggs. Yes, but also it's fairly small, it flies, it has thin, short legs, a short tail. These attributes built up a schematic picture of what we think a bird should look like. Note that this doesn't give us a typical dictionary definition, but it seems to be rather the way our mind works with the concept of bird, based perhaps on the birds we see most frequently, the things that we most often hear people talk about as being birds. So this is a summary of some of the prototype effects that we've just seen from these experiments that come from psycholinguistic research. And they suggest that our minds understand words through prototypes rather than through clearly bounded sets defined by necessary and sufficient conditions. That is, conditions that say, if you lay eggs and have feathers, then you are a bird. So first, there is remarkable agreement across different people as to what the best examples are for a category. They call these goodness of example ratings, and also what the bad examples are. Second, when you ask people to name an example of a category, like name a bird or name a piece of furniture, they are more likely to respond with a prototypical member for birds like a robin or a sparrow, for example. And third, there's what we call a priming effect. That is, after people are primed that we are talking about birds, for example, using a generic category label like that, they will respond more quickly to questions about prototypes than they do about marginal members. For example, we just saw they'd answer yes or no to whether a robin is a bird much quicker than whether a duck is a bird. So that introduces some of the ideas of prototypes, but it's also important to realize that our prototypes are not the same irrespective of the context. They can actually change based on what context a word is used in as to what comes to mind first of all. For example, think about what kind of bird you think of when we hear bird in each of these contexts. First of all, if you say he could see a bird flitting in and out of the hedgerow, or maybe to our mind, we are now thinking of that sort of small bird with the small beak and small short tail. But if I say he could see a bird standing in the water, maybe you have a different prototypical bird that comes to mind. For me, it's something like a flamingo or a heron that comes to mind straight away, with long legs and probably a longer beak. Or he could hear a bird squawking in the canopy. Or maybe now what's going to come to your mind more closely is something with bright colors, maybe long tail feathers, if you're thinking about a forest scene. And when I say he could see a bird running in the distance, probably an ostrich is going to be much more salient now. It's going to come to your mind much more quickly. That is the kind of prototypical bird you'd think of in this context. The point is that certain birds share certain attributes or family resemblances with others. And when we hear it in the word bird used in certain contexts, we think of birds with those family resemblances, even though birds as a whole might share little in common with all members of the category. Wittgenstein was wrote about this for the category of games, or the concept of games, claiming that they too share very few, if any, attributes altogether. I'm going to read a bit out from Wittgenstein's book in a minute, but just to introduce you to who he was, Wittgenstein was a philosopher from the first half of the 20th century, and he was actually initially very convinced by the mathematical logic of word meaning, those kind of ideas of necessary and sufficient features that you could use to define words and then include them in logical relationships when you're talking about sentence meaning. However, he later came to realize that this was not realistic, and that words were actually much more complex and their relationship with how our mind works. And his reflections on how words actually mean things to people became a foundation for later cognitive linguistics. But let's look for now at what he says about games. This is a longish quote, but I think it's helpful to see how our mind potentially associate meaning with the word game. He says this: consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean, board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say, there must be something common, or they would not be called games. But look and see whether there is anything that is common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. For example, at board games with their multifarious relationships. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out and others appear. When next we pass to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are all amusing? Compare chess with noughts and crosses, or is there always winning and losing, or competition between players? Think of patience. In ball games there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of games like Ring-a-Ring-a Roses. Here is the element of amusement, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And we can go through the many, many other groups of games in the same way. We see how similarities crop up and disappear. The result of this examination is we see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances, for the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. I shall say games form a family. How is the concept of a game bounded? What still counts as a game and what no longer does? Can you even give a boundary? No. So his point here is there's no prototype for game, really. There are many different prototypes, many groups of games that fit together because of their different characteristics. Rather, we need to perhaps think of a network of related prototypes. And we're going to come on to that idea in a few slides. So this understanding of categories being based on prototypes or on family relationships revolutionized ideas for thinking about how we go about describing word meanings. And I want to look at the challenges of that with this example that is often talked about in the literature, the sentence, "The Pope is a bachelor." Now, do you think it's true or not if I say the Pope is a bachelor? Do we know what a bachelor is? How we describe the meaning of the word bachelor? If we think that a bachelor can simply be defined as an unmarried adult male, then we should say the Pope is a bachelor because he is an unmarried adult male. But most people think that the Pope is not a bachelor, or certainly not a good example of a bachelor, because a bachelor should be eligible to be married, and perhaps it also connotes a certain lifestyle. The problem here highlights the difference between two different approaches to lexical semantics. According to the classical approach, word meanings are based on distinctive features, similar to those in phonology, works well with structuralist assumptions about language. So maybe a bachelor has the features plus male, plus human, plus adult, maybe minus married, if you think that these words like male, human, and married are somehow semantic primitives. Then there would be truth conditions, like entailment and contradiction, to fit these together within sentences. So the Pope is a bachelor. If the Pope is adult, unmarried, and male, then he must be a bachelor. But there's something goes wrong here because we don't think that this sentence is true, and we can't really explain that when we use distinctive features and truth conditions. So it's easier to use a cognitive approach to lexical semantics. In this approach, our understanding of word meaning is based on prototypes, which develop from our lived experience of bachelors. So a prototypical bachelor is an eligible male of marriageable age. And maybe we've seen examples of them, or we've heard people talk about them in our families or in our communities. In this case, the Pope is not very close to this prototype. So this statement, the Pope is a bachelor, certainly raises questions. With this model, words are not associated with meanings that are rigidly defined according to particular features. Rather, words are points of entry to complex networks of meaning in our minds, structured around different prototypes based on what we've seen in the past, the way we've heard these words used in the past. So how might this idea of concepts structured around prototypes actually work in our minds? How could we model what's going on, how we build up associations of meanings with words? It's important to think about how this happens as our mind develops meanings over time from being a child onwards. And Langacker describes this when he's thinking about the word tree and how a concept of tree might develop for somebody. And he develops the idea of what's called a schematic network, which I'm just going to explain for you now. So Langacker is thinking, how does a child develop a concept of a tree? So first of all, maybe a child sees different objects, a beech, an oak, and an elm, and he hears them described as a tree. And so, or somehow I've got to unite together this idea of a beech, an oak, and elm. These are all in one category, a tree. So the child creates a schematic generalization of a tree with a trunk, a certain shape, broad leaves, perhaps. However, then perhaps that child discovers that pines are also referred to as a tree. And so we have to revise our concept. What was tree 1 now becomes tree 2, which has to include as well the idea that a pine might be a tree. And a pine has obviously a slightly different shape, taller, straighter profile, different kinds of leaves on it. It needs to extend the prototypical, sometimes what's called the gestalt, the image we have in our minds of a tree, to include trees with needles. So this is going to be even more schematic, even more abstract than the picture we had for grouping together beeches and oaks and elms. It needs to unite together both deciduous and pine trees. Then perhaps we get exposed to a palm tree. And again, we need to extend from our prototype to deduce some kind of schematic tree that covers or sanctions all of palms and pines and beeches and oaks and elms. Note that with this model, the schematic networks we have for words depends very much on your childhood and your other life experiences. If you grew up in a tropical country, they would have developed a different concept of tree, as palms were much more prevalent there. And then you'd have to possibly add in a schematic network to extend to cover things like mangoes rather than beeches and oaks and elms. And they wouldn't be used to leaves falling off trees at certain times of year. So that wouldn't be an important part of the way that the different groups are fit together. In this example with tree, we're only really looking at perhaps what we'd call one sense of tree, even though there's some vagueness about whether it's a palm or a pine or a deciduous tree. But we could also use this schematic network approach to model polysemy, where there is more than one sense. So think about the sense of a tree in a genealogical tree or a tree diagram in linguistics. These are other uses of the word tree that we could see expanding out as well from this. And we're trying to say, well, what is it that connects these senses of the word tree to the images that we have of palms and pines and beeches and oaks? As another example, let's look at the word ring. When you hear the word ring, how many meanings can you think of? Maybe this is the kind of one that comes to mind first of all, like a wedding ring. But there could also be a ring like this, some kind of marking on the ground, perhaps. Not an object, it's a symbol. Or a ring like this. This isn't actually a circle, it's a ring with a different shape. Or here, this cartoon says, early we reported police busting a counterfeit ring. We're now learning it may not be a real counterfeit ring. Well, the use of ring here is something to do with a criminal gang doing something. A ring around Saturn or another planet. Here it's lots of rock in space. A boxing ring. In this case, it's not circular at all. It's something square around the edge of a competitive arena. Or something like this, the ring of fire, volcanoes and earthquakes around Japan and the coast of the Americas. It doesn't even join up here, but it's something that has some kind of curve to it. How could we model how our mind might structure the concept associated with ring? Well, this is one way of doing it. We might think at the bottom of the page, what is our category prototype? The first thing when we hear the word ring out of context. I might put here some kind of circular object, like a circular piece of jewelry. And you can see how here we've got horizontal lines showing how we can extend from this prototype to other uses of a word. And sometimes those have dots to show there's actually a meaning extension to something slightly different. So from a circular object, we can extend to the idea of a circular mark, like the ring left by a coffee cup or that chalk ring on the previous page. This is an extension from our basic prototype. And then as we looked at with that example of the tree, we can look at a higher level then of schematization, a more general picture of something, a schema that is more abstract but covers or sanctions the prototypes at the lower level. So here we've suggested a circular entity is something that will sanction both the circular mark and the circular object at the lower level. The idea is that this isn't a fixed structure, but things can be added and the links can be changed about different things as we experience different uses of this word. But the point is here, we're trying to say this isn't just a random bag of different meanings, but there is structure. Things are connected in some way. Those that are close to the prototypes, and then sanctioning schemas, and then things that are linked to those sanctioning schemas, but further away from our original prototypes. So you can see here, the arena or the group of people operating clandestinely are linked to that circular entity in some way. They're extensions from that, further away from our original prototype. This is an attempt to represent how these ideas are held in the mind. Then when you hear the word ring, it sends you into this network. And depending what context you're working in at that time, you might enter into this network at different points. This kind of approach can be applied to biblical languages. If you are looking at trying to describe a Hebrew or a Greek word, for example, this is an example from my PhD thesis, which is called Surrounded by Bitterness. I was trying to apply this model, the schematic network model, to the root tsarar in the Hebrew Bible, trying to show the connections between the physical meanings and the use in emotional discourse for anyone in distress. So this root, in some cases, seems to have a prototype of being used to hold something firmly in place in some kind of wrapping, whether it's a stone in a sling or kneading troughs wrapped up. And then it's used for a variety of different things with that similar idea, like the water being held in the clouds. And then there's maybe some sanctioning schema, which is of some kind of agonist restricted or held in place in some way. And that fits into wider ideas of being in distress or being in a cramped space, or a woman being in labor. You can look at this in more detail if you want to, or read about it in my thesis. This is another example of a biblical word being studied from the New Testament, the Greek word proseuchomai, normally translated prayer. This came from a student who was doing their dissertation and applying this approach. She came up here with a category prototype of public vocal prayer that can happen anywhere, typically alone, but in sight of other people, and then looked at extensions from this prototype and then found the sanctioning schema. She suggested a verbal communication of humans with God. And she was trying to use this to help think about how do we go about translating this word into Simihiti, the language she was working with. Here's an even more complicated schematic network, which was done by David Tuggy, I think, on the use of the word head. Two things that are important here to notice is, once we get this so large, what are the sort of salient things that stand out, or the important parts of this network? One is the high-level abstract schemas, such as the most important part, which is up on the top right here of this picture. The other one is highly salient prototypical structures, such as human head. That's probably the one we're going to come across most often, and that's the one he's got this very thick black line around at the bottom. Finally, here's one more example where I was trying to explore the semantics of the word mission for a paper I wrote about whether Paul is a missionary or not. With this example, we can see that the prototypical meanings of mission may be connected to different domains, and I've got domains in different colors. That is, what we think of as mission may have a different prototype when we're thinking of overseas interactions, where I've got here overseas mission is maybe going to faraway places to rescue people from damnation. Whereas it's different when we're thinking about an organization's mission in secular corporate life, where it may be the goal or the purpose of a corporate entity, that our business's mission is to do this. That is, in order to begin thinking about why one of these sentences in the schematic network might stand out more than others in a given context, we need to introduce the concept of domains. Just then we had this domain of overseas interactions, or the domain of corporate business life. This is the way that Taylor talks about domains. It says, a domain may be defined as any knowledge configuration which provides the context for the conceptualization of a semantic unit. It's the background, the context, which helps us understand a word or a semantic unit. And he gives an example. The 7-day week is the semantic domain against which Monday is understood. Three-dimensional space is the domain against which up and down are understood, and so on. Here's another example. Think about the word salt. Typically, when we hear salt, we associate it with the food domain as a way of referring to sodium chloride. an additive we put onto food to make it taste nice. So certainly if we're sitting around the table and somebody says, pass the salt, this is the domain we're going to think of. This is the kind of salt we're going to think of. But if we're in a chemistry class and someone talks about salt, our minds may not think of table salt at all, but rather any chemical compound that is a mixture of a metal and a non-metal, like potassium bromide or any number of other compounds. The point is that the domain against which a word is profiled has an impact on where we enter into the lexical schematic network and what sort of prototype we think of. Let's also look at domains associated with the word mother. So the word mother can have different prototypes or different models associated with it, depending on what domain it's understood connected with. Lakoff argues that there are several domains associated with mother in his book, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. And he uses some examples with the word real to help us see how there are these different domains. So if you have an example like this, I was adopted and don't know who my real mother is, that suggests that the mother is the one who gives birth to you. And he suggests, therefore, there's a birth domain within which we understand a particular concept of mother, the one who gives birth to you. But in this example, I don't like playing with children, so I don't think I could ever be a real mother. Here, it's not to do with giving birth that makes you a real mother or not. It's to do with the fact that you like being with children, that you like helping children. So it seems that there is another domain, the nurturance domain, in which we think of mother or a real mother as the one who raises a child. Those are the attributes that are most important. Or as a rather more unusual example, he gives this one. My real mother died when I was an embryo, and I was frozen and later implanted in the womb of the woman who gave birth to me. In this case, the real mother is not the one who gave birth. The real mother is the one who contributed the genetic material. So it shows that even genetic mother is another domain that is separate from birth mother. So the word mother can have all these different meanings depending which domain we're thinking about, whether it's the birth domain, the nurturance domain, or the genetic domain. Let's go back to the ring example and try to think of what domains may be associated with the different sentences. So we see here we talked about the group of people operating clandestinely. That could be in the crime domain, perhaps. So if we're talking about crime and we hear about a ring, we're probably going to think first of the group of criminals rather than a piece of wedding jewelry. Similarly, if we're talking about sport and we hear about a ring, somebody's in the ring, we're going to think about the arena or about boxing. When we're talking about weddings and we hear mention of a ring, we're probably going to think of the piece of jewelry. Similarly, if we're talking about fashion accessories. So depending on what domain we're in, what context the word is used in, then a word is going to have more salient prototypical things that come to mind as concepts in our mind when we hear it. So what are the key points? When you're trying to describe word meaning, make sure you don't get trapped by looking for an unrealistic, rigid definition. It has to have these features or those features. We have to be prepared that things may not fit neatly into categories with rigid boundary conditions. Instead, think about different prototypical uses of the word. Think about what domains those are used in and how they might be related to each other. And then you can think, are there more abstract schemas that link together several different uses of a word, those kind of sanctioning schemas? So you're thinking about what are the prototypical uses of this word and what are the abstract generalizations that link together different groups of uses of this word to make those kind of family resemblances, the attributes like Wittgenstein talked about with games. And if you want to try and describe word meaning, then it probably means getting out a big piece of paper or mind mapping and trying to fit these things together. See if this works. See if this actually connects with how you think you understand what words mean in different contexts. Or you can have a look at some words in your own language and try and think, how would I describe it? How are these words used in different senses? What are the things that I associate with this word? How does it link together different life experiences that I've had? How would I go about modeling the concept in my own brain? And have fun.